honestly, I think this is a very nice live example of, why some of this hype mongering around the technology sector
Yeah.
should perhaps be deflated just a bit.
Yeah.
How many
Yeah.
of my techno-optimist talks have been derailed by a PowerPoint failure?
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustabia, on fait le bunga, bunga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm, as usual, in São Paulo, Brazil, and as usual, also Alex Hochuli. So we like to encourage debate on this podcast, and of course, debate isn't only or even primarily about winning, much less about scoring points, and much more about political clarity or the pursuit of that. So in a recent episode, our guest Alex Gendler, that was episode 488, Homo-Techno, Homo-Solo, Post-Homo. In that episode, we discussed this acronym, TESCREAL, which is an acronym which stands for transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. And now you're probably listening to this going, I don't know what you're talking about, unless you listen to that episode, or perhaps you're one of the select few people who knows what this is and means, and I'm not even sure if I do. So we're going to explore this a bit further. Anyway, in that recent episode, our guest Alex Gendler argued that what underpins these varied ideologies is a certain rationalism or a rationalist worldview, which ultimately resolves itself into a sort of arid utilitarianism, which in the final analysis is anti-human. Now, for today's guests, the use of Tescriel by left-wing critics is a form of conspiracy theory, which postulates a shadowy web of post-humanist Silicon Valley elites. So in this spirit of debate, we've invited them on to put their case forward, their contrary case forward. And I think this is especially important to do in light of the seemingly rapid advances of AI and its adoption across society, the risks and possibilities associated with AI, and particularly the new and often strange ideologies that have coalesced around new technologies. So without further ado, let me say hi to our guests. Eli Sennesh is a postdoc at Vanderbilt studying neuroscience. Hi, Eli, and where are you calling us from?
I'm just calling from the office.
From the office in a nowhere space on the internet?
No, in Nashville, Tennessee.
Okay, excellent. And very happy to welcome James Hughes, who is the Executive Director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. He's also Associate Provost at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And in 2004, James wrote Citizen Cyborg, which is an argument for a social democratic transhumanism, while at the time serving as the director of the World Transhumanist Association, which is now called Humanity Plus. James, hello, welcome.
Hello.
And where are you calling from?
I'm living here in Connecticut.
Okay, excellent. And finally, would like to say hello once again, one of the many times, to a contributing editor to this podcast, Leigh Phillips. Hello, Leigh.
Hi, guys.
Excellent. So, as a way of introduction, I thought I would say give a nod to history. So, there were once a tightly organized group of masked men who destroyed stocking frames in the East Midlands, shearing frames in Yorkshire, and power looms in parts of Lancashire over 1811 and 1812. Such was the strength of this unrest that the British government deployed 12,000 troops to quell it, which was more troops than the Duke of Wellington took to fight Napoleon over control of the Iberian Peninsula a few years earlier. But contrary to the way that these men were immortalized in the term Luddism, these men's politics and political social action were not directed against new machinery at all, but against changes to the labor process aimed at cost cutting. So these men were led by Ned Ludd, and in the face of assembled techno-futurists here today, I'll cast myself in the role of Ned Ludd, which isn't an outfit I wear totally comfortably, though I have to say myself I've grown to hate the internet and to a certain extent fear AI. So I'm going to lean into that here, because Well, our guests, you'll find out what they believe very shortly. And Leigh Phillips, I'm sure listeners will know, is a satanic advocate of techno fixes, a loather of nature, and so on. But actually, in truth, it is a left-wing humanist science writer and a geologist. So we'll hear more from Leigh, but I'm sure your listener are already familiar with, and we should turn to our guests. But one final mention: there's a bunch of episodes which listeners maybe would want to check out, in which we discussed associated matters. So we had a reading club episode on the book Inhuman Power, Artificial Intelligence, The Future of Capitalism, which I recently re-listened to, and I found it quite interesting, if I can comment that about recent BungaCast episodes myself, and we've linked to that in the show notes. We had an episode about artificial intelligence and the end of history, in which we discussed economist Tyler Cowen's recent suggestion that radical technological change today marks a major turning point in history. And that's a question which I want to put to our guests today as well, towards the end of this. And then we also had another episode which proved rather controversial, with Amber Trotter, on egg freezing, in which listeners were horrified that we turned against our stated Prometheanism to be critical of technologies which are meant to be liberating. But I would restate that episode was a social critique about what these technologies enable, rather than the technology itself. Anyway, let's end this kind of self-referential thing that we're doing here, that I'm doing, and get on to the matter at hand. So, transhumanism and politics, that's the heading I've got here. So to Eli or to James, whoever wishes to jump in, and we'll have this kind of as a free-flowing conversation, and Leigh will jump in as well. Where does TESCREAL come from? What is this acronym? And who are Gebru and Torres, the people who coined it?
I'd like to take that just to sort of start with the most extreme position, and then we can water down and moderate from there. I would have to say that in my view, TESCREAL comes from these social critics, basically taking a bunch of things they don't like and lumping them all together in what is ultimately sort of about, let's say, a sectoral dispute over management of capital, in the sense that, in the sense that when I read about all this TESCREAL stuff, and this is not noted in James and my article, I really wish I should have put it in there, but the important thing that is never actually mentioned is the people who work in the sectors ostensibly producing these technologies. So there's really some sense of, that I get from these accusations that everyone working in these sectors is somehow a convinced, Peter Thiel acolyte, cultist, whereas, they should be politically disempowered from power over their own jobs, what little they have, in favor of, say, for instance, the kind of social critics who write about race and gender, perhaps at universities or for newspapers.
That's neat. Yeah. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, I would say there were a couple things that we wanted to do with the essay that we wrote. The first was to say, look, you're a Procrustean in your approach to the intellectual history. There were people on the left, or ways to interpret all these ideas from a left-wing perspective all along. These ideas go back to the origins of the Enlightenment, Condorcet, and so forth. They are natural outcomes of when you try to put together techno-optimism, science, rationality part of the Enlightenment with the democratic empowerment, individual liberty, and egalitarianism of the Enlightenment. You come up with these ideas over and over and over again. So then to say, well, look, there's a couple billionaires who have particularly reactionary versions of these ideas, and they have dabbled in a variety of these ideas that have tenuous links throughout intellectual history. So in the first place, they pretend that there's one thing, and it's not one thing. It's a bunch of different things and a bunch of very diverse things that you have ignored the diversity of. And secondly, as Ellie, I think, really made clear in the essay that we wrote, this is an inversion of traditional Marxist understanding of base and ideology. It's like, if you want to understand why Apple just published a paper saying that AI is a crock, it might have something to do with the fact that they are behind in the market and they're trying to dump on everybody else's AI. The financial incentives may have more to do with the way that these firms act. Musk is going to interpret whatever thing he dabbles in, whether it's Wahhabism or Tescriel ideas, he's going to interpret them in the way that is most flattering to his idea of his own agency in history. And that's just true. Whether, most of the multi-billionaires in the world are not Tescrielites. They're Wahhabists or Methodists or, Putinists or whatever. And that doesn't explain very much about their behavior compared to their material interests. And that's one of the points we were trying to make.
Though, can we actually just go ahead and grant that, Elon Musk and his thing of test tube babies is, I don't know if I'd call it eugenicist, but it's certainly freaking weird.
Well, eugenics is one of those umbrella terms that keeps getting linked to everything, depending on whether people are talking about the baby bust or reproductive technologies or transhumanism or whatever. It's a boogeyman term in the whole debate.
Okay, well, I mean, so you guys write in this article that's linked to in the show notes, which I would encourage listeners to read. You write that the wholesale condemnation of these ideas has cast a pall over all thinking about humanity's future when we desperately need to grapple with the implications of emerging technologies. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on why you find that this acronym and its use, to the extent that it's been picked up a little bit more widely beyond technology and technology critic circles, why it kind of has this role in not really making people think.
Well, let me just start with the example of Peter Singer. Peter Singer's controversial bioethicist, but he basically has made the ethical argument that all of us have a moral obligation to give up our wealth above subsistence, our own subsistence, because it could be better put to uses elsewhere. And he's trying to do this through voluntarism and social charity, but it's not an intrinsically right wing argument. He's not a right wing person. He's been on the left his entire life. And so the fact that he and his logic has been central to a piece of what they're arguing against, the kind of consequentialist approach to public policy, which I think is really the only defensible approach to public policy, depends on how you do it. And Peter Singer has made very left-wing and egalitarian arguments in these spheres. So just as an example, to cast aspersions of all effective altruists or all long-termists as if they're eugenicists or whatever is just absurd.
I'd like to add that in a lot of ways, I think the kinds of reasoning that are criticized as TESCREAL are really just intrinsic to capitalism in certain ways, particularly the utilitarianism, the quantification, etc., etc. Like, come on, this is just the value form, guys.
Okay, well, that's good, because I mean, I do want to come on to that specifically, because, well, as both Alex Gendler argued in the episode to which you're kind of responding to here, that there is a kind of core rationalism or utilitarianism there, which is to be critiqued or not. And maybe Leigh wants to come in and say something in defense of it.
I think one of the problems here is that there's this conflation of utilitarianism and rationalism. I don't think there's anything wrong with rationalism. Aren't we all supposed to be rationalists? Any sort of descendant of the Enlightenment is supposed to be a rationalist. Utilitarianism is an ethical stance that, I mean, my personal opinions, I think it has many issues that it ends up getting tied in all sorts of different knots. And that ultimately is what we're criticizing when we're criticizing, or when, say, Alex Gendler was criticizing effective altruism and long-termism. Yeah, for sure. Ultimately, if you're thinking about the potential, infinitude of humans that will be born that out in the future, then that necessarily outweighs the 8 billion humans today. So we're an ethical speck of dust. I mean, that to me, that obviously immediately runs into problems. But it's the utilitarian aspect that we're criticizing, not necessarily the idea that we should be rational with respect to how we spend our charity dollars.
Okay, well, so let's mention charity dollars, and of course that's the aspect of which relates to effective altruism,
yeah.
Which is probably the thing that the element of TESCREAL that people have most encountered, I would wager, and it's the least out there one, as the authors of this piece note. Basically, utilitarianism applied to charitable giving. So that sounds kind of fairly banal. But let's work through TESCREAL, if you guys wouldn't mind. I mean, I don't necessarily think that we need to work through every single element of that acronym, but if you wish, we can do that as well. Because I think part of what your argument is that Tescriel isn't really a thing.
Mhm.
It isn't, these authors, Gabriel and Torres, have joined together these different ideological strands into one thing and tried to make it sound scary. And you argue as a consequence that there's a kind of conspiracy theorizing around it. But to really understand it, we should break it down, right? So let's go through the letters of the acronym and, as you wish, making comments about any aspect of it you wish.
Sounds good.
All right, so I just want to note as a matter of current events that the first element of the acronym is T, transhumanism. And, as of today, let's see, massive headline in the New York Times, how the transgender rights movement bet on the Supreme Court and lost. And so I do want to sort of throw back this accusation that, people who've been attacking the specter of transhumanism for a while have, I do want to say, been feeding into a right-wing narrative that people getting gender reassignment surgery, cross-sex hormones, et cetera, are practicing transhumanism. And then I do have to fully bring that to political fore and say, look, if actually existing transhumanism is respecting transgender people, using their preferred pronouns, or, not discriminating against them in the workplace, what the hell is wrong with that?
Right. And we mentioned before we got on Ozempic. I mean, right now we're at the place where obesity, the rise of obesity, was driving down life expectancy, deaths of despair, of course, as well. But Ozempic is a perfect example. It's too expensive. We need to figure out how to get it to everybody, but it could, in fact, be a universal salve for some of the illnesses of aging and increase people's health span. So this is real world today transhumanism. When people are worried about, oh, we're never going to be able to upload the soul, it's like, let's worry about that when we get there. The things that we need to worry about now are reforming the FDA. We have a fully accelerationist, anti-regulatory FDA right now. They're going to get rid of animal trials. They're destroying all the scientific infrastructure. So, we're in a situation where the state capacity to actually ensure that things are safe and to get things through the pipeline is being destroyed. So for me, that's the number one transhumanist cause right now.
And I have to add to that, speaking as a scientist who works with, well, closely connected to animal research, that, we don't just do this kind of thing because we want things to be safe when we eventually give them to humans, but because we want them to be effective as well. Destroying all of this research infrastructure and public sector state capacity is not just a way of, letting dangerous things come to market. It's also just a way of letting, old-fashioned snake oil and scams come to market.
Mm.
Just back to the transgender point. I mean, it has been striking to me with the rise of global fascism how central the attack on gender ideology has been to that entire network. I just saw a survey from Pew, I think 24 countries around the world. In every single country, there's a gender gap on attitudes towards American MAGA fascism, with women much more hostile than men. And I think that this reflects a global sex gender system realignment as women's empowerment has been threatening patriarchy. But transgender folks have become the symbol of that. The idea that we could be post-gender in some ways, that people could just have a choice of what gender expressions and morphologies they have, that is central threat to the global patriarchal backlash that we're seeing.
Yeah, just because we can be critical, say, of CIA cutout, NGOs in China or something, or in Iran that, are perhaps being used for State Department interests. And I acknowledge that, some of those organizations have tended to raise, the LGBT banner since the Obama years. Just because we can be critical of the state infrastructure of progressive neoliberalism does not mean that we need to throw a mass constituency under the bus in the name of fighting this imaginary thing, transhumanism.
The pride flag is not a color revolution.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
The only other thing I was going to say along this, or rather a sort of question, is, with respect to transhumanism, have we not always been transhuman? Have we not always always been cyborgs. If we're defining it as the sort of the integration of technologies into the human body or around the human body, I'm wearing glasses at the minute. 3 of us are wearing glasses.
I have contact
That's
lenses.
to some extent because I wear them all.
We should be sent
like
to
I
the
take them
fields,
off,
surely.
or heart monitors or something actually physically inside, or clothes. These are technologies that we've, clothes we probably had before there were even Homo sapiens. So, yeah, haven't we always been transhuman?
The mastery of fire allowed our prefrontal cortex to grow, which allowed us to invent new tools. So co-evolution.
Yeah, I mean,
and
as
of
someone who
course-
doesn't think too much about this stuff, but I was always, I even like the Italian futurists, to that extent, which is getting pretty close to fascism, which is no comment on my political allegiances. It's more just aesthetic preferences. But I would always like the appeal of humanity in charge of the massive, powerful machines, but much less turned on by the idea of humans turning themselves into machines. Though maybe that's naive on my part, because those two things are not so easily separable.
There's a meaningful difference between mechanical machines and biological machines, scare quoted scientifically. Of course there is. But, I think the problem with the term transhumanism in a way is that it's anchoring from something like a religious viewpoint, something that starts by saying, there's a Platonic essence of the human being, and when we somehow deviate from that essence, we're committing a sin and need to be punished for it.
Right. And we can hold to a notion of human nature in a very thin way, but which is fundamentally about humans as laboring and creative beings who can transform their environment and indeed transform themselves. And that's perhaps an idea of human nature that we can hold to rather than to some fixed essence.
Right.
But
becoming rather than being.
So maybe we should continue as a way of exposition, continue working through this acronym, if you'd be up for that. So extropianism next.
So just my own personal history, I first got interested in transhumanism when I got online in 1991 and found the Extropy mailing list, which was based in California but had a global membership. And I got on and said, "Hi, I'm a socialist, blah, blah, blah." And immediately the flame war started. So that was my first introduction to the fact, there were people thinking some interesting thoughts about the future of technology. They want to turn themselves into nanobots and whatnot, but they are rabidly anarcho-capitalist, and this is not the place that they're going to let me talk about any of my stuff. Eventually, I found the more open-minded Europeans. But Extropy, I think when we were writing our essay, Extropy was the Hail Mary, because it was really a small group of people. It was, basically one guy, Max Moore, and then some of his acolytes. And they had a culture and they had some ideas, but they didn't really have factions as such, or left or right wing. But I made the Hail Mary by talking about the fact, well, the Soviets had also ideas about, Extropy is the idea that the goal of humanity should be to increase the amount of organization in the universe to fight entropy. And as a goal, why not? But it's like saying that my goal is to increase the amount of strange attractors in the universe. It's like, okay, maybe that's a legitimate goal, but it doesn't really lead you very far. But they had taken an anarcho-capitalist direction. We were just trying to say, look, it doesn't have to be anarcho-capitalist to say that you want to increase the amount of order in the world. That doesn't sound like anarcho-capitalism, really, to me.
So, I will be a bit more critical and say the thing about entropy versus extropy is that when you get into the maths that define what entropy is or what order versus disorder is, there's always baked in assumptions about what kind of order. So if you don't have a certain, if you don't have a notion of desirable order that you're bringing to the math, then it doesn't really mean anything. Like, yes, entropy in the astrophysics sense just means, eventually everything's going to turn into, cold dust floating around, maybe individual protons and neutrons in, 100 trillion years or so. But I don't think that's really our problem.
Okay,
we don't have to deal with the problems of 100 trillion years from now today. We really don't.
So this second letter in the acronym is something that we can be safely dismissed as
they were a thing. 1988 to say 2002 when they disbanded. And now they have basically moved in and taken over the rest of transhumanism.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, they like genealogically they have influence, but it's better to say maybe that they're similar to an early example of a group chat in the sense that, we all know nowadays, what with, say, the US government conducting its national security policy, you know, group chats can be very politically influential, and you should sometimes be critical of what goes on in the group chat. But, that doesn't mean that it's that doesn't mean there's something intrinsically
Yeah.
Dodgy about it. So I mean, I guess
yeah.
the issue with a lot of this stuff is that it sounds a bit weird, and it was fine. People were fine with it when in the 90s and 2000s they were the stuff of group chats or of small online subcultures and so on, and then suddenly they seem to have emerged into the public sphere in a big way because they're tools wielded by those people with a lot of wealth and power.
Well, I think that is sort of the thing that tends to happen with group chats, isn't it? That, if you get a bunch of professionals together in a group chat, and I'm sorry to use the P word there, Alex, but, if you do this, eventually one or more of them are going to progress in their career, and they're going to wind up freakishly influential unless every single person in the group chat has their career crash.
But I do think it's important to point out that the extropians were championed by Reason Magazine, Cato Institute,
Yeah.
people in DC who saw them as a new kind of sexy libertarianism, and they were to that extent. And so but when I did the surveys of our membership, the World Transhumanist Association membership, only 20% of the members affiliated themselves with those ideas, and the plurality were people on the left. So yes, they've always been very influential, especially among affluent Silicon Valley types, but not in the rest of the world of transhumanism.
Okay, interesting. So let's run through the rest of these quickly as a way of then moving on to kind of the ideology critique stuff. And indeed, your critique of some of other people's ideology critique of it, if that's not getting too meta to follow along with. Anyway, the one I can't pronounce, singularitarianism. And maybe you don't want to dedicate too much time to any one of these. I leave it
Well,
up to you. But
let me just describe singularitarianism. The means of production are going to advance so quickly at some point that they will rupture the social relations of productions in ways that we really can't predict what kind of society might come out of that. But we have to start thinking about it now and preparing for that eventuality, which we think is definitely going to come. That sounds to me like a pretty central Marxist predicate. So I don't understand why people are so bent out of shape. Now, clearly, the singularitarians didn't take it in a Marxist direction. It's a very different kind of argument sometimes, but it's basically an argument about the relationships of technology and society.
Well, I mean, I would add that the singularitarians were sort of picking this stuff up in the 90s when it appeared possible that you could have, a fully defeated Marxism, a fully defeated socialist movement, a defeated left, but also consistent high rates of compounding economic growth. Now, whether that is actually true, I actually think is more doubtful.
Well, that's a really good point, because that the period in which those two rivers flew into one another was pretty brief, as you say. This is an artifact of maybe the 1990s. After the defeat
Yeah,
of socialism, after the defeat of working class, where we still had growth. So I mean, that's quite interesting. Maybe we can come back to that in a bit. Let's just run through the last couple of them, if you'll entertain. Cosmism, which is another one where it's like no one really thinks this.
Cosmism was a philosophical milieu, or it wasn't even a
in
movement.
Russia.
In Russia.
In Russia, in the 19th and early 20th century, that influenced the Bolsheviks, actually.
The Bolsheviks.
Right, yeah. As well as Eastern Orthodox mysticism, but
Cosmism is the reason they preserved Lenin's body in the hope of resurrecting him from the death, from
right.
death,
Yeah.
from death later.
Yeah, thinking that Bezos or Musk are secretly cosmists is quite a stretch, but yeah,
Bezos
I think
and Musk do not want to resurrect Lenin. I'm sorry.
I know transhumanists who would love to resurrect all the dead, but even they don't call themselves cosmists.
Right, and then
if I'm remembering correctly, sort of the slogan of the Cosmos was it conquer death and storm the heavens and conquer death. And so the storming the heavens was the idea that prior to the space age was that we could visit other planets, and then that served the Soviets with Sputnik, were the first ones to actually sort of achieve a step on on the way there. And surely conquering death could be read as just improving our lifespan, our health span. And again, we draw it away from sort of grand visions and just look back at what we've actually achieved over the course of the 20th century. Again, aren't we all cosmists to some extent, in that we've extended our lifespan quite considerably? And
well,
the
some
focus
people
now is
aren't.
Sorry?
I mean, some people aren't. Some people are greens.
Yeah.
Indeed. And I was going to say that unfortunately there are still many billions of people on the planet that haven't experienced this to the same extent that those of us in the first world have. And surely any socialist would want to extend the benefits of that cosmism to the whole of the world.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Leigh Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage Magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.